When I think of the Pentium III, I almost always think of either the Coppermine or Tualatin versions. How could someone not? These are some of the best CPUs Intel ever made, and it's no wonder why they are so popular amongst retro builders. But the Pentium III didn't start with Coppermine. There was an entire generation of Pentium III that came before that is often overlooked. But why? Today we'll be taking a look at the Pentium III Katmai, the original Pentium III. On the surface, this doesn't really look all that different from a Coppermine Pentium III on slot 1, but since we've removed the heat sinks, we can see that there is one notable difference on the PCB. On Katmai, we have these two cache chips right here, and on Coppermine, we don't. This is because the Katmai Pentium III is built a lot more like a Pentium II than Coppermine. And when I say built like, that's kind of understating it. This basically is a Pentium II with a few bells and whistles bolted on. But why did Intel do this? Before we answer that, let's go over Katmai's specs and understand what it is before we go into why it is. The Katmai is built on Intel's 250nm process, just like the Deschutes Pentium II. It has 512 kilobytes of external L2 cache, which is clocked at half the core speed, just like the Deschutes Pentium II. They even use pretty much the same core voltage. Now, this doesn't look great for Katmai, but it does at least have a couple advantages over the Pentium II. The Katmai Pentium IIIs were available in higher clock speeds than the Pentium IIs, which topped out at 450 MHz. Katmai started at 450 MHz and went up to 600 MHz. And there were even a couple models available that used a 133 MHz frontside bus. Those seem to be pretty expensive now, so I don't have one. But my 600 MHz one here is using the regular 100 MHz frontside bus. Aside from clock speed though, the other major improvement was the addition of SSE instructions. While MMX kicked off the supplemental x86 instruction sets, SSE is where things really started to get wild, and Intel would go on to make like a billion different versions of it and all sorts of other instructions, but that's for a different time. SSE was sort of an answer to AMD's 3D Now, although Intel didn't really market it as hard as either MMX or 3D Now. Something I just learned while researching for this video is that SSE was originally called Katmai New Instructions, or KNI. Intel then changed it to Internet Streaming SIMD Instructions around launch because it's 1999 and Internet. They eventually dropped the Internet part, thankfully, and just called it SSE. SSE is meant to help speed up floating point operations, which is very useful for 3D graphics processing. This sounds great, but in 1999, almost no software was really available to take good advantage of it. Within a couple years, this would change, but at least at launch, SSE wasn't going to be seeing much use. It's worth noting that Intel did also come up with a new memory streaming architecture for the Katmai, but this was mainly to help out SSE take better advantage of memory bandwidth. The Pentium III did also introduce one key thing that was actually quite controversial at the time. This was the processor serial number. This was a hard-coded identifying number built into every single Pentium III that was used to list specific information about the CPU, such as its clock speed. This was an attempt from Intel to crack down on resellers, modifying or just relabeling chips as something else, usually a lower-end CPU that had been overclocked to a higher-end one. This doesn't sound terrible at first glance, but Intel caught a lot of heat for this at the time since the serial number could be used as a unique identifier of an individual's computer and thus be used to track users. You were eventually allowed to block this feature from being accessed in many motherboards' BIOSes, but it's interesting to see that many of the same security concerns we're still facing now were already being faced over 25 years ago. And that's pretty much it. Katmai does have some improvements over the Pentium II, but in the grand scheme of things, they're pretty minor. I doubt many high-end Pentium II or especially overclocked Celeron owners were all that excited to upgrade to it. So this begs the question, why did Intel call this a Pentium III? This is clearly closer to a Pentium II than Coppermine, which moved the cache inside the core, made it much faster, was built on a smaller 180nm node, was available at much higher clock speeds. Okay, now you could go with the opinion that it was justified given the new SSE instructions, and calling it a Pentium II just wouldn't really feel right, And I agree to an extent, but Intel could have just called it the Pentium II SSE or something like that, much like they had done with the Pentium MMX. I think they didn't do that though, mainly to avoid an issue they had faced back with MMX. Intel marketed MMX hard. They were cramming MMX advertising anywhere they could to try and distance themselves from AMD and Cyrix. The problem is, Intel was eventually forced to license out MMX to its competitors, and this meant that Intel's special new marketing was suddenly working against them. That alone was probably a major reason why Intel named it the Pentium III and didn't market SSE. Since Intel very much owns the trademark for Pentium, that couldn't be licensed out, keeping Intel safely atop the marketing throne. Though I'd also like to propose another possible reason for jumping the name up to Pentium III. I think that might have been due to AMD finally starting to catch up. Also Apple, but let's talk AMD for now. During the Pentium II days, AMD's offerings were fairly far behind Intel's. AMD managed to carve out the low-end PC market along with Cyrix, but AMD's K6 and K6-2 struggled to pose any real performance threat against the Pentium II. The K6-3 started to change this though. AMD began putting 256K of L2 cache on die to help speed up performance. Wonder where I've heard that one before. AMD was still stuck using the old Socket 7 platform, and a huge limitation of Socket 7 is that the L2 cache lives on the motherboard, and for the CPU to access it, it has to go over the frontside bus. This posed a huge bottleneck compared to the Pentium II design, and was one of the reasons why AMD struggled to catch up. But with the K6-3's internal L2 cache, AMD closed the gap significantly. Depending on the benchmark, the K6-3 and Pentium II were often neck and neck, and I think Intel might have started to feel the heat a little for the first time. You have to keep in mind that these chips were cheaper than the Pentiums, not to mention the motherboards were usually cheaper as well. And gassing up the old K6-2 wasn't the only thing AMD had in the pipeline. They were hard at work at their true next-gen chip, the Athlon, which took many design cues from the Pentium II design. What I'm getting at here is that Intel did this purely to be on the same playing field as AMD when it comes to marketing. Consumers are dumb, and just look at irrelevant names and numbers to base their conclusions on that. So continuing to release a product with a 2 in the name when our competitor is releasing a product with a 3, and they're cooking up a brand new product line and brand name as well, slap an extra numeral on there and ship it. I'm not sure how late this was done in development, but it's worth noting that Katmai and the K6-3 released in basically the same week, at least if these dates are to be believed. But another aspect to consider is Apple and their heavy marketing push with PowerPC. Right around this time, Apple was beginning to make waves again in the computing industry thanks to Gil Amelio and the return of Steve Jobs. Apple had been marketing PowerPC as the superior architecture against Intel since 1994, and with the introduction of the G3 processors, this was only continuing to heat up. The Power Macintosh G3 launched at the end of '97, but clock speeds would rise especially once the blue and white G3 came out. Not to mention all the other hot new products Apple was cooking up, such as the iMac, iBook, and new PowerBooks, all of which used G3 processors. Did you notice how there's a 3 in there? Yeah, this is all speculation of course, but one has to wonder if AMD and Apple both having competing products with a 3 in the name, and the addition of not being able to market SSE like they did with MMX, didn't influence Intel to introduce the Pentium III with Katmai, rather than wait for the true next-generation successor, Coppermine, which wouldn't be ready until the fall of '99. Of course, by then the G4 had already come out, but Intel will eventually deal with that problem as well. Something worth mentioning is that many of the early Katmai engineering samples used Pentium II enclosures. Now, I'm not saying this is evidence that Intel was going to call these Pentium IIs, it's very likely they just used them since they already had them, and the Pentium III ones hadn't been injection molded yet, but it's an interesting thing to note nonetheless. Now, I've talked a lot about the differences between Katmai and Coppermine, but let's actually get into the specific differences so we can benchmark them. What I have here is the Coppermine 600E. This is the direct replacement for the Katmai 600. They both use a 100 MHz frontside bus and have a 600 MHz core clock, so this will be pretty much a direct comparison. I've been bringing it up throughout the video so far, but the main thing that sets Coppermine apart from Katmai is the L2 cache. Coppermine might at first look like a downgrade, only having 256 kilobytes of it compared to the 512K on Katmai and the Pentium IIs. But as I've mentioned before, Coppermine moved the L2 cache on die rather than having the external setup. The benefit of this being that L2 cache was now clocked at the full speed of the core. So on this one, the cache is running at 600 MHz compared to just 300 MHz on this one. The L2 cache was also now 8-way associative as compared to the 4-way associative on Katmai and the Pentium IIs. These two factors should drastically speed up cache performance and should translate to higher performance, unless the workload benefits from having a large amount of L2 cache as opposed to faster cache, though I doubt that was very common. Coppermine's other advantage is being on the new 180nm node, where Katmai was still stuck on 250nm. This also brings about a much lower core voltage, lower power consumption, lower heat output, and the ability for Coppermine to scale much higher, where it would eventually top out at just slightly over 1 GHz. Though that was really pushing the limits for Coppermine, and the 1.13 GHz chips were a stability nightmare. Now that we've got the differences down, let's see what other CPUs we're including. I don't have a Pentium II 450, unfortunately, but we'll throw in my P2 400. We have our two 600 MHz Pentium IIIs, and I have a 500 MHz Katmai to throw in the mix as well, just for fun, to give us some extra reference points. Other people have already done benchmarks comparing Deschutes and Katmai clock for clock, so if you really want to know the differences between those, you can check out like Phil's Computer Lab's video on it, and who knows, if I end up getting, same clocked chips at some point, I might try it out. But our main focus today is just comparing Katmai versus Coppermine clock for clock. Our Windows 98 test system is my recently put together Slot 1 and Voodoo 3 test rig. It has an 8-bit BH6 with the 440BX chipset. This board has been fully recapped and works quite well. Has 256 megabytes of PC100 RAM with CL2 timings, a Voodoo 3 3000 using the Amiga Merlin 2.9 drivers, and an Aureal Vortex 2 using the 2041 drivers. Let's start with good old classic Cinebench 2003. Here we see Coppermine pulling ahead of the Katmai by 8 points. This might not seem huge, but compared to the gaps between the other chips, this would almost be like Katmai running at 700 MHz. Right off the bat, the cache is already making a huge improvement. I believe Cinebench does have SSE support, but it doesn't seem to be having a huge effect here. 3D Mark 99 again shows a decent lead for the Coppermine. This is the overall 3D Mark score, but if we take a look at the specific CPU score, we see 3D Mark 99's SSE optimizations in action, as the score between the Pentium II and Pentium III 500 is huge. The difference isn't as big between Katmai and Coppermine, but it's still a decent bit better. For the game benchmarks, all games will run at 640 by 480 with high settings. In Quake 2 using OpenGL, the Coppermine is almost 10 FPS faster than Katmai. A lot of CRT monitors can support 120Hz at 640 by 480, so this would be noticeable to some people looking for an ultra-smooth experience. Quake 2's software renderer puts a much bigger strain on the chips. Coppermine is only 2 FPS faster here though. Quake 3 is OpenGL only, and we're seeing a 6 FPS improvement out of Coppermine. Okay, I have to pause it here. If you're wondering why the Quake 3 scores seem suspiciously low, as well as some of the other benchmarks that you'll see in a minute, see, I have the Aureal Vortex 2 installed in the computer. I am not that familiar with the Vortex 2, and I, was kind of excited to finally really give it a shot in the system, and I was like, oh, I should turn on A3D. That would be a great idea. Turns out, A3D is a resource hog and puts a lot of load on the CPU that I didn't know about. I was running these benchmarks at like 1 a.m., so it didn't really hit me until the next day. I was like, man, those scores are kind of bad. Like, Quake 3 should be running a lot better than this. I disabled A3D, and it gained 20 FPS on Coppermine by turning off A3D. So, keep that in mind when you're looking at these graphs, that I kind of did an oopsie. Although, I mean, I guess it is putting extra load on the CPU, so that's better, maybe, I guess. I don't know. It is what it is. I'm not going back to re-benchmark all 4 CPUs. UT99 is using the glide renderer here, and Katmai is about 2 FPS behind Coppermine. I should note that the UT Bench demo file I'm using is extremely CPU intensive, and even a 1 GHz Pentium III won't crack 50 FPS in it, so bear that in mind. I just realized this has been slightly out of frame the whole time. And finally, Expendable gets just shy of a 2 FPS improvement from the Coppermine. And now for a new benchmark that I've never used before, but one that was very popular back in the day, is Windstone 99, specifically the business version of the tests. This tests everyday tasks like spreadsheets, web browser performance, and the like. Coppermine gets 28.1 Windstones, and Katmai gets 26.5. What's a Windstone? I don't know, but Coppermine's better. So we've seen that Coppermine is indeed faster. In many scenarios, it's quite a bit faster. But in others like our gaming benchmarks, the difference isn't massive per se. That's not to say that Coppermine still isn't an improvement. It was faster across the board compared to Katmai at the exact same clock speed. Now, Coppermine didn't come out until October of '99, where Katmai launched in February of 1999, so it's not like Katmai was immediately replaced with something far superior, but I think that it just didn't really excite people in the same way that Coppermine did, especially since Coppermine brought about much higher clocks and actually significant improvements. Katmai did pretty well with the OEMs, making its way into many high-end desktops and workstations, but for the enthusiast, Katmai just didn't offer a ton over the Pentium II, unless you went for a top-tier one, and even then, you have to factor in the Celeron. I've already gone over why Celerons during this time were so special, but let's summarize by saying they were cheap and they overclocked like crazy. A high-end Pentium II was straight up irrelevant compared to an overclocked Mendocino Celeron, and the Katmai wasn't that much faster. If we take a look at the graphs from my video I made on the Celerons a couple years back, note that the test system was slightly different, so you can't exactly compare the results. Also, I didn't have A3D turned on, which is what clued me into why the performance was so bad. The 600 MHz Katmai is definitely ahead in the benchmarks, but not by enough to really warrant its large price tag compared to the Celerons. The 600 MHz Katmai retailed for over 5 times the price of the $130 Celeron that I overclocked to almost 550 MHz in that video. So yeah, it's pretty obvious why enthusiasts barely cared about Katmai. What about today though? Does Katmai make any sense for a retro build? Well, yes and no. If you were planning to build a late Pentium II era system, then, well, Katmai makes a pretty good substitute. The Pentium II 450 tends to go for a lot more than the Pentium III 450, and they have pretty similar performance. But for the rest of the Katmais, unless you just happen across one for a good price, there's really not much reason to seek one out, especially not the 600 that I have here, as that goes for way more than personally I think it's really worth. You're better off just buying a Coppermine in pretty much every scenario. The 600E that I bought here was just over $22, and it came with a heatsink. And if you know anything about buying a Slot 1 CPU, you know getting a heatsink with it is pretty important, since the heatsinks can often cost almost as much as the CPUs do a lot of times. And that's about all I have to say about Katmai. I wanted to do this video for a few years now, ever since I ran across this 600. It just fascinated me that there was this intermediate design of Pentium III that just doesn't really get a lot of attention. Hopefully you learned something, and hopefully I didn't make too many mistakes. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.